Welcome to tonight's webinar. Tonight's webinar is all about the, sorry, I gotta get to the right, gotta get the slide going, Ricky, sorry. The Every Student Succeeds Act and what you can do to impact ESSA implementation. And this is the first of 3 webinars. This series is a collaboration between National Down Syndrome Congress, National Down Syndrome Society, and Down Syndrome Affiliates in Action, and we're all happy to be working together to bring you such great information. I think I mentioned earlier that we have almost 400 registrants on the webinar tonight, and most of them are logging on as we speak, but we don't want to wait any longer. I want to introduce our speakers. They are Ricky Savia, who's the Senior Education Policy Advisor for the National Down Syndrome Congress, and we'll go more information on our speakers. And then Heather Sachs, who is the Vice President of Advocacy and Public Policy for the National Down Syndrome Society. We're going to have a lot of other speakers coming up in the next 2 sessions, but I want to turn it over to Ricky and Heather to start tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Deanna. I just have to ask, am I doing the slides because they're not moving?
No, they're, and actually I can give them to you. So we're going to try this. We had a little thing when we started. So I'm going to actually give you the keyboard and mouse. And then just move your mouse around and see if you can advance the slides.
Are they advancing?
Nope. But I can advance them for you. How about that?
Okay, I'm only seeing mine on the screen, so I can't see what you're advancing.
Heather, can you see mine?
I can, yeah. I think it's probably better if maybe Dina just drives it. Yes, the agenda is up on the screen for everyone.
Okay, well that's what I put up there too, so let's see how this works. So the agenda is up there on the screen, and if I can't see it moving, then you just tell me and I'll move it on my screen too. So the agenda is up there on the screen. This first webinar is in a series of 3, as you know, and we are focusing on the background and the importance of the Every Student Succeeds Act. And we will also be talking a little bit about ESSA accountability and implementation, federal advocacy, state advocacy, and ESSA and IEP advocacy, although a lot of those topics are for the next 2 webinars. So as I said, this is generally an overview. I have moved it to meet the speakers. So there's information about both Heather and myself for background about our different roles. I am the Senior Education Policy Advisor for the National Down Syndrome Congress, and hopefully you could see the slide that has some information about me. And Heather Sachs, there is also information about her on this slide. So I'm on the background slide now. Hopefully everyone else is as well. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, called ESSA, was passed in 1965 as a civil rights law. And at that time, it was mostly focused on children of color and children who were living in poverty. At that time, as you know, there were not laws like IDEA that required the students with disabilities attend school. But over the years, as that law has been amended and given different nicknames, it was broadened to include not only students with disabilities, but English learners and other ethnic and racial groups as more students entered the school that needed more supports. So ESSA was amended by the No Child Left Behind Act, which I'm sure you've heard of, NCLB, in 2002. It is the same law. When they amend it, they give it a new name. And when that law was amended yet again in December 2015, it was called the Every Student Succeeds Act, which I use the acronym ESSA. Some people say ESSA, but I'll use ESSA just because it's less of a tongue twister. It is very important to know what the purpose of ESSA is. Title I is the main accountability provisions in ESSA, and its purpose is to provide all children, so all children includes children with disabilities, with the opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education and to close educational achievement gaps. And as you'll see as we proceed in the conversation, this purpose is very important because it sounds very different from the conversations you probably have in your IEP meetings about a free, appropriate education and how that can't be the best education. And, you know, really they talk about a low standard, but yet under ESSA, the standard is one of opportunity for high quality education. So progressing to the why is it important to your child. So it is a general education law that applies to all students. And we always say our students are general education students first. And this law makes that happen. It provides all kinds of requirements and protections for students, including students with disabilities. And its focus, because it was a civil rights law, is on certain subgroups of students. So it's about all students, but it's particularly about making sure certain students, which are called students who are considered at a disadvantage or historically underserved students, were to get a level playing field so that they would have an equitable high opportunity for a high quality education. So this language raises the bar under IDEA for a free appropriate education and supports the need for inclusion. So as many of you are probably aware, there was a Supreme Court case argued yesterday around the issue of free appropriate public education. And in some of the circuits around the country, it has been argued in prior cases, many of them 30, 40 years old, that all free appropriate public education means is some de minimis, you know, bottom basement, some educational benefit sort of education. And the language in ESSA really raises the bar, because if that law applies to all students, then it applies to IDEA, and that word appropriate should be interpreted in the context of ESSA as well. And that, in fact, is one of the arguments that was made in this case. And in fact, NDSC signed on to was involved with 3 amicus briefs, and I know NDSS was also involved in an amicus brief, and that ESSA argument was made as part of the argument to say that you can no longer say that free appropriate education just means some de minimis, not even barely meaningful education because of ESSA. And it also pushes the system change the parents need in order to advocate more effectively. So under IDEA, you have your child's IEP, but basically you can't change the system with that IEP. You basically butt up against whatever it is your district is willing to do or not do if it is not fully implementing IDEA the way it's supposed to. But under ESSA, as it was true under No Child Left Behind before it, it's about systems change. It looks at how students are performing at schools, has requirements for what must happen if schools are not performing well for their students with disabilities or their children of color or their English language learners or these, you know, any of these main subgroups of students on which the law focuses, and says, you know, state, district, school, you need to do something about that. So it goes beyond the individual parent fighting for their child. It says the system needs to change, and that is very important, especially for families, you know, probably unlike a lot of the families are on the phone who are very strong advocates for their child. There are a lot of families out there who don't have the wherewithal to be really doing that fight. We all know who they are, and this helps move the system for everybody. And it also helps move the system for us, because I have a child who's 25, he's not a child, a young man, with Down syndrome, and I know that even though I was a very good advocate, you know, I could only go so far unless the system moved with me. And it also can enhance implementation of IDEA if your state ESSA plan is strong. So what we will discuss in the next few slides, what happened in ESSA and how so much of what happens got thrown to the state and requires your advocacy. And if your ESSA plan is strong for accountability for students with disabilities, then that is going to help require that your child's education is done in a way that they make progress, and that is going to help implement IDEA.
Oh, so
well, I was going to say I'm sorry?
There's a couple of questions, and I don't know if you wanted to go ahead and just knock them out because they all have to do with what you've just been talking about.
Okay, we could do that. I cannot see them, so you're going to have to tell me.
No, it's okay. That's why I'm here. I'm moderating. So there's two questions. What's the case name that you're referencing? And then will ESSA be affected if SCOTUS does rule on the case of the boy with autism?
Okay, so the case is called Endrew F. And if you Google Endrew, E-N-D-R-E-W, that's the name of the case. And there's a lot of information on it right now out there. ESSA will still be effective regardless of how the Supreme Court rules on the case. The problem is going to be that if they decide that FAPE is just a de minimis standard, that it's going to create complications because it's going to, in some ways, lower some of what ESSA already is saying should be. But we still have ESSA to fight with. So we will still have that to say, well, you know, that may be how you define FAPE under this law, but under this law, it says all students have X. I don't think that they are going to come in with just a de minimis standard. I think that they will raise the standard. The question is how much they will raise the standard, how confusing the language will be, and I have a little bit of concern that whether or not they're going to say things in there that give the impression that certain kids, you know, don't have as high standards as other kids. And that will all remain to be seen. But ESSA is still ESSA, and it's still the law in this country. So, and they're not interpreting ESSA, they're interpreting IDA, but we're using ESSA to try to help them raise the interpretation of IDA. It's complicated. I hope that answers the question. Is that okay with the question?
Yeah, I think we're moving on to the next slide, I guess. So
yes, before No Child Left Behind, what isn't counted doesn't count. So my son was in school before No Child Left Behind, so I've seen it both ways. And what happened, and I was actually on a committee in my district where we would go around and try to find out, you know, what was happening for kids with disabilities in the schools. And when we would go to the schools, nobody would know anything about what was happening for students with disabilities. You know, the principal couldn't tell you, they'd bring the special educator, she couldn't tell you. They didn't have any data separately on students with disabilities. If they were taking the state assessments, they didn't separate out that data for kids with disabilities, so they didn't really know, you know, how they were doing on anything. And so therefore, you know, nobody was really focused on their academic performance. And school improvement plans that every school has to have did not include strategies targeted at students with disabilities because no one was really looking, basically. And IDA required that there be alternate assessments for any state and district-wide assessments, but it didn't really say what standards those assessments were supposed to be based on. So the bar was pretty low, I mean, I know a lot of you struggle with getting the bar high now, but let me tell you from having been there before, there was No Child Left Behind started focusing on these different subgroups. And I should go back to say that before No Child Left Behind, there was accountability in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, but it was averaged across the school. Nobody was looking at the separate subgroups. It was with the reauthorization in 2001 with No Child Left Behind that they started saying your school can't be meeting adequately yearly progress, which is what the term was for meeting standards, if all your kids overall are doing well, but if these subgroups are doing poorly. So it made more power to how these subgroups were doing. It counted more. And so that is what really changed things. And so alternate assessments were not necessarily on grade level content. No content knowledge was required for special educators back then. And so we don't want to go backwards to that. So that's, you know, a key message as to why this is so important. So what happens in ESSA? So there was good news, and actually quite a bit of good news. And DSC was able to get important provisions added to the sections of ESSA that govern alternate assessments, because for a very long time we were governed by regulations, and these regulations did not have very high standards for students who took alternate assessments. They would say things like, that they have access to the curriculum to the extent possible, and this was a real issue. And so we went into ESSA and said, okay, we need to change some of this language. And this is going to be a lot of the focus of the third webinar about the language that raises language for kids in alternate assessments, and that you can use in your IEPs along with IDA, to help argue for stronger education for your child. And we will just kind of gloss over a bit later in this PowerPoint some of those provisions, but they are critical, and it was a real win. A lot of people think that the only kids who won under ESSA were kids who have significant cognitive disabilities because of this language. And so the bad news, though, overall with this law is that there was unprecedented discretion given to the states. So there was this real push by Congress that education should be in the state domain, and that the federal government should not be telling the state what to do, and that we need to give the reins back to the states in terms of what they put in their state plans, and we have to give a lot of discretion to how they design their accountability system, because they didn't like that under No Child Left Behind, that if their schools were not meeting adequate yearly progress, that there were some definite consequences, and they didn't like those consequences. So they were fighting back against that and trying to make the federal government not have as much power or authority over the implementation. So moving to the effective dates and timelines slide, most provisions were effective starting in August 2016. And the U.S. Department of Education has been issuing regulations and guidance, which hopefully you have seen action alerts and information alerts come out from NDSC and NDSS on those over the year. In 2016, the states had been transitioning to ESSA and working on an implementation plan which will be submitted in this year. Originally, it was supposed to be March and July. The regulations just changed that to April or September of this year. Originally, the most important provisions where the states and districts identify schools that need support and improvement under ESSA was supposed to happen in the 2017-2018 school year. Now that's been pushed back to 2018-2019. There is not a lot of clarity as to what happens in terms of identifying schools that need improvement between now and then. For the 1 year, there was a transition plan up through the 2017-18 school year. I'm assuming that that plan will stay in place through the 2018-19 school year, and they will continue to identify schools as they have been, which were considered priority and focus schools. You may have heard those terms. And then in 2018-19, they will start identifying the schools using the different language that's in ESSA. So some of the accountability changes in ESSA, some of the things that in No Child Left Behind had less flexibility now have more flexibility in ESSA, and that is not necessarily to our benefit. Assessment design, there is more flexibility there. States can select and weight the indicators for accountability, and that's worrisome because they can take something like the state assessment scores and make that a very small part of what your overall accountability system is, and have a lot of weight on things that are really nebulous to measure. They can put more in about surveys and parent satisfaction and things that are soft measurements as opposed to the really hard academic measurements that we would like as advocates to see measured. There's concern about the participation rate. There was a provision that we've had in the law all along, and that is still in there, that 95% of students at the school, as well as 95% of each subgroup, so 95% of students with disabilities at your school, have to participate in the state assessments. And the reason for that is that it used to be that they would take kids, on the field trip who had disabilities and not have them take the state assessment, and that would skew the results. And under No Child Left Behind, that counted for a lot. Like if your school didn't meet that, they were not going to meet this adequate yearly progress period. Now it's left up to the state how that is factored in. So that's another area of concern where they could, not have all the kids take the test and then not have it mean that much that they didn't. They get to identify schools for improvement and support, and they get to determine what the criteria are for that, and they get to decide how many years it takes before they do anything and what they do. So again, these are all issues that we're concerned about and want to make sure these state plans are strong so that it doesn't take students doing so horribly or forever, before anything is done at a school when kids with disabilities are not performing well. And then teacher evaluation, that has changed some. There are no requirements except if ESSA funds are used for this purpose. It used to be that under No Child Left Behind and the waivers that teacher evaluations, were based somewhat on test scores, and that is not the case. In some ways that might be better because it made the teachers very up in arms about accountability because they felt like they were being evaluated and it wasn't really fair because they may have, a class where students just, come from difficult backgrounds or whatever. And not that I necessarily agree with all those arguments, but it's not really worth it to turn teachers against accountability. Also, teacher qualifications, effectiveness, and experience definitions are very important and up to flexibility under ESSA. We used to have highly qualified teacher requirements, and that was very important, and especially in special education where they were expected to have content training and certain level of education. And with ESSA, they took those requirements out, and under the federal law, really a special educator only just has to have a bachelor's degree, pretty much in anything. So it's up to your state to have higher standards. So switching to the slide about how we're supporting strong ESSA implementation. Using our education policy expertise, we've been trying to keep expectations high and accountability strong. We've been working a lot on information and tools to help families know what's going on federally and in their states regarding ESSA implementation and how they can have a role in the process. We're providing tools for use in state and local advocacy. A lot of this is going to be discussed in greater detail when we talk about state advocacy in the second webinar. And we've been collaborating with NDSS to get all this information out to families. Okay, so we have the federal advocacy slide and then federal ESSA regulations. So the statute is the law. And then regulations basically put some of the meat on the law. The law says what has to happen, what is required by Congress to happen. And then this agency, in this case the Department of Education, is supposed to put out regulations to help states. So how do we make that happen in a way that meets the purpose of the law? So the regulations are really important in a lot of instances, but especially in this one because so much was left up to the state. And a lot of times they forget that the purpose of the law is this, provide the equitable opportunity for a high quality education for all students, that the regulations we worked really hard on at the federal level to make sure that they put in options and examples to show ways states could meet the requirements of the law in a way that met the purpose that they were supposed to be serving. I mean, they get a lot of money through ESSA, and it is important that they use that money in a way that meets the purpose, and not all states are doing that, as we know. So it's very important to get as much in the regulations as possible to give them guidance and put some guardrails around what they needed to do. And we thank you parents, because parents of children with Down syndrome really responded to these regulations. One of the regulations, I went on to see the different comments, and out of like 120 comments, there were at least 40 of them that said, I am a parent of a child with Down syndrome. I am the grandparent of a child with Down syndrome. And because of that, I believe, was the reason I was asked to be on a stakeholder engagement panel with the Secretary of Education, because I think they really saw the parents of us students with Down syndrome were engaged. So thank you very much about that. Now, one sad note we may be having around the regulations is, so we got regulations that are not all that we wanted, but are stronger than the law. and that's important. The problem we may face now after the election is that there is something called the Congressional Review Act. And what this does is it allows a new administration at Congress to go in when there's a new administration and overturn regulations from the prior administration going back a certain number of days. And the way the days calculate out for the Obama administration is basically Congress can go back from mid-June to December of 2016, and they can take sets of regulations and decide to disapprove of them. And this requires only a majority vote. So, there's a majority of Republicans in the Congress, and if they choose to do that, if they don't want these regulations from the Obama administration, they can go back, and usually it's one bill for each regulation set, so it takes a while to do this, and there's a lot of regulations they may want to do this with, and this will slow it down. But there is also an effort to get this on a faster track so they can group regulations together. And this has only happened once in the 20-year history of the law, and the reason we're concerned right now is that both houses of Congress and the president are of the same party. So if Congress decides to do this, the likelihood that the president would veto it is very small, and then this is a real nuclear option, because if these regulations are disapproved of and repealed, then under this law, the agency, the Department of Education, can never again, not just during this administration, but never again, put out substantially similar regulations. So it's a really big deal. And it's not just on education, it's on any type of regulation, and there are like 90 sets of them that could potentially fall under this Congressional Review Act. But I bring this up just so you know, if there is an alert around this, that this is what we're talking about, and I gave a link to an article with more information on that. Okay, and now I'm going to hand it over to Heather.
Thank you, Ricky. I just want to, I just want to give Ricky props. We are so lucky to have her in our community and doing the work that she's doing on the federal level and on the state level. Ricky really is, I'm sure I'm embarrassing you, Ricky, but she really is the expert on ESSA and so many other education-related issues for our kids, and works very, very hard to keep everyone informed and to get the best possible outcome for our community. So thank you so much, and it's really a pleasure to be working with you on this, and I'm constantly learning from you as well. I just wanted to talk a bit about stakeholder involvement under, you're welcome. I just wanted to talk a bit about stakeholder involvement under ESSA. As Ricky mentioned earlier, ESSA does require meaningful stakeholder consultation, that's the wording from the law, in the development of the draft ESSA plan and afterwards during a public comment period. So right now, states are, going forward. They're already forming ESSA implementation committees. Many of them already have released draft plans. But what we're seeing is that they're really rushing the process. They are not really giving much notice for comments. They are not doing a very good job of involving the parent and disability community. And parental involvement is absolutely essential to ensure that the state uses its ESSA discretion widely. States do seem to be putting out meeting notices, but you really have to look for them in many cases. I challenge all of you on this webinar to ask yourself, have you been made aware of ESSA efforts in your state? Many of us are on different listservs and, part of Facebook groups and getting information about, education issues from all different channels. Have you seen anything yet relating to ESSA? Because you should have. States are, most states are now taking this up, and they need to be making us aware. Luckily, Ricky through NDSC has put together a working Google Doc, and I believe there's a link to it later on in the webinar, and it's also, through the NDSC website if you go to that. And what Ricky is doing is trying to really keep track of exactly what is going on in all 50 states regarding ESSA. So if you're, one of the first things you should do, after this webinar is try to go to that Google Doc, figure out, where your state is in this process, what's going on. And then the next step is to make sure that there are parents and representatives of the disability community at the table. States, I think, really do not think that we're watching, and we need to show them that we are. And then just another, little side note in that federal legislators are really expecting parents and local advocates to be providing oversight on this process. As ESSA was, being finalized, we had repeated conversations with Hill staff about, our concerns on the discretion being given to the states, and routinely, the reply was that, they believe that that it is incumbent upon parents to get involved and, make sure that our community is represented and standards stay high. So what can parents and affiliates do? As I said before, the first thing should be to find out about stakeholder activities in your state regarding the ESSA plan. What exactly is going on? Who is at the table? If there's not disability representation at the table, you need to fight tooth and nail to get them there. An example of this where we successfully did it was in Maryland. And now Ricky and I live in Maryland, and, we really do seem to have our finger, on the pulse there. But even in our state, when the Maryland State Department of Education put together their ESSA committee, they initially did not have any disability representatives on the committee. Luckily, we got wind of it, and advocates in the state of Maryland really pushed back, and then we were ultimately able to get 2 disability representatives onto the committee. I know that the same thing happened in California, and the advocates there really banded together and tried to push back, and their effort was unsuccessful. And, the ESSA plan wound up, it wound up that there wasn't disability representation at the table. So, please keep track of different statewide advocacy groups as well. Now is the time to really, go reach out, to various groups, the ARC, the disability rights groups, other interest groups, the autism group, cerebral palsy, the Protection and Advocacy Organization. Just get on the email list, read their newsletters, see what's going on, and try to cast your net as wide as possible. And again, a great place to look is this NDSC Google Doc. I would also encourage you, when you're looking at the Google Doc, Ricky's only one person, and it's very hard for her to keep track of what's going on in all 50 states. If you have information that she doesn't have on there, please absolutely reach out to her and give her that information regarding your state, so it's as up-to-date as possible. And then you should just know that Ricky and NDSC is in the process of doing analyses of certain key states, and they're going to try to do a template to help people figure out what to look for in these ESSA plans and see what is missing in their own state. And, we're definitely going to get into more of the details of the, key state plan accountability issues and, what these plans need to look like in the second webinar series. We'll also get into some more details about, how you can help organize and really, strengthen grassroots advocacy on these issues. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so there are, some key state plan accountability issues. This slide is just some of the main terms to get familiar with. They're all going to be discussed and explained in the next session, next Thursday night, actually. But, some terms you should become familiar with would be minimum subgroup size, definition of consistently underperforming subgroups, identification of schools for targeted or comprehensive support and improvement, indicators of school quality, strategies regarding the 1% cap on alternate assessment participation, the definition of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities for alternate assessments, and then supporting excellent educators and supporting all students initiatives. Again, we will discuss this more on the next webinar, but it definitely would be helpful for you to familiarize yourself with these key terms. Also on the NDSC website, Ricky has developed sample comments and talking points A lot of these issues are described in detail within the documents that have already been created that are on the NDSC website. So if you want to do some reading between now and next week, I encourage you to look at that and cull through that information. Let's go to the next slide.
And Heather, could I jump in 1 second?
Sure.
I just wanted to say that at Heather's recommendation, I am culling through that, and I'm putting together a glossary so that we will have a link to that at the next one. And if there's some way to get it out before the next one, like up on the website, DSAIA website, or some link, I will do that, because it is there's a lot of information in a lot of places, and it was a very good suggestion to come up with a glossary. So it's a mutual admiration society. Thank you, Heather.
You're welcome. The important thing is that there's, as this list shows, I mean, there's so many different issues and critical decisions, and, states are going to be, using these issues to impact accountability for kids with disabilities. So Ricky and I together will do our best to, put together information and get the information out to you all as much as possible. Okay, so just to the next slide, just a little advertisement for the third webinar in the series. The focus on that's going to be on IEP advocacy. A lot of folks don't realize that there is a very strong tie between ESSA and IDEA and IEP advocacy. So Ricky has pulled together some documents. The links are there. You can literally print them out and bring them to your IEP meetings. They're very concise, and they have tips on how you can use ESSA to your advantage to make sure that standards remain high for your child. So again, Ricky will go more in depth on this on the third webinar, but in the meantime, feel free to go to those links, especially if you have an IEP meeting coming up in the next 2 weeks. Let's go to the next slide. So just some examples, as I mentioned, of ESSA changes that impact IEPs are this 1% cap on alternate assessment participation that Ricky spoke a little bit about. There's also an emphasis on enrolled grade content, progress in and not merely access to the general education curriculum, proficiency, and the definition of that, and that it's, the pursuit of post-secondary education or competitively paid integrated employment, the opportunity for every student to earn a regular diploma. And there's also some new alternate diploma provisions in ESSA. The development and use of accommodations to increase participation in general assessments, and universal design for learning, UDL. So these are ways, as I said, that you can actually use the law, ESSA changes, to address these issues in your own child's IEP. Let's go to the next slide. So again, in the same webinar that we talk more in detail about tips for the IEP using ESSA, you will be treated to a presentation by the NDSS Advocacy Programs Assistant, my colleague, Adrian Forsyth. He's a self-advocate who will share some tips with you and with your self-advocates with whom you work and live and love in federal, state, and local advocacy. We firmly believe that the self-advocate voice is the most powerful voice at any table, and I encourage you always to invite them into the discussions and try to consider their perspective of all of this. Let's go to the next slide. One other thing I did want to point out too, actually, about self-advocates is that they, as I said, they should always have a voice, but also to please remember that sometimes their voice is not traditional. They can always communicate in some way, even if their speech is not that clear, or if they're using an assistive technology device. It may present some additional layers of challenges to get to their voice, but it's in there. And so, Adrian can speak a little bit more about this from his own perspective, but it's it's very important to involve self-advocates in all education advocacy and just, any type of advocacy in general. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So both NDSC and DSS have a robust social media presence, a lot of information on our websites. These are just direct links. We both put out information and action alerts, and we have our own newsletters. It's really important to sign up for both because we, while we intersect on a lot of topics, we also may come at certain things, from different angles, hopefully not oppositional angles, which is, typically not. But we both are really, trying to do what's best for the Down syndrome community, and I think you will get the most comprehensive view, especially on these education issues, from both of our resources. So these are the NDSC links listed. On the next slide are the NDSS links listed. And as I said, just, go ahead and like it all and subscribe to it all. Very important to sign up for Advocacy Alerts. This is our, automated system that Ricky and I worked together and put together NDSC, NDSS joint education alerts. As Ricky mentioned, this is very, very important. And we appreciate everyone that has really answered the call on this. Typically, when we send out alerts, something is happening, and we need the voices of the community to weigh in and to do it very, very quickly. So we really take pains to provide you with whatever information you need, including talking points, exact links of where to do things such as submit comments. We try to make it as turnkey as possible for you, while always encouraging you to feel free to personalize it and add your own voice. But we really do rely upon our grassroots advocates. And my colleague, Jawanda Mast, who's the NDSS Manager of Grassroots Advocacy, will talk more about this on next week's webinar. And I believe that is it. So it looks like we have a few more minutes for questions.
And we do have some. Thank you, guys. So let's just a reminder that if you do have a question, I see some hand raised every once in a while. Just type those into the question pane, and I'll read them aloud so that the people that are hearing the recording of it later will know what the question was. The first question that it goes back a little ways, so sorry, Ricky, this is probably for you. Is this systems change advocacy only related to impacting schools receiving Title I funds?
So there are parts of ESSA that are specifically around Title I schools, and there are other parts that are for all schools. And all schools will be looked at and get summative ratings or, dashboards about how their students are doing, and they will be reporting on all schools. There will be, so when we have indicators that states pick to look at as for how kids are doing, that will happen in all schools. When they determine which schools are identified for targeted support and improvement or comprehensive support and improvement, which we'll go into more next week, some of those things apply or are only required to apply to Title I schools. Some of those apply to all schools. Some states are choosing to apply even the things that they only have to apply to Title I to all schools. So it's a mixed bag, but it's definitely not just for Title I schools.
Okay, great. So the next question is there a quick link to the final regulations available, or is it best to search on Google for those of us like atypically dry literature?
Well, there is on the Department of Education website, which is the ed.gov website. There is a ESSA page, and on that page there's a list of resources that has excuse me, all the regulations, and there have been a bunch of very helpful guidances that are put out. That's something, a link that we can put in the webinar for next time when we get into, more details about advocacy. But if you, look on ed.gov and look for ESSA, you should hopefully be able to pretty easily find the resource page that will have all the different guidances and regulations linked to it there.
So back in some of that other stuff, so if they get rid of the regulation, this is when you were talking about that one topic, but the law is still on the books, are they basically gutting the law if you can't adopt regulations to implement the law?
They're not gutting the law. The law will still be there, but it will have a lot less guidance to states. For example, I'll give you an example. One of the ways that any school can be identified for support and improvement is if there are consistently underperforming subgroups. So if your students with disabilities at the school are consistently underperforming. And states, according to the law, are supposed to define what that means. But in the regulations, it says that consistently should mean 2 years unless you justify why it would be more than 2 years. So, you know, that's an example of ways in which the regulations kind of close in the parameters. There's also language about who are students with the most significant cognitive disabilities who can take alternate assessments. And in the regulations, they put some parameters around how you would define that, so it wouldn't become, you know, too broad a group. So there are all these different ways in the regulations that some parameters were put around what was in the law, and without that, you know, it would be more of a free-for-all. There would be less legs for us to stand on to say, no, this violates the regulations, you know, you went too far with your discretion. But the law would still be there. It would just, you know, be harder to advocate. The other piece that, you know, we are concerned about is that the states submit their plans and then the federal government reviews them, and we don't know how much federal review is going to be given as compared to in the past, or whether they're just going to kind of rubber stamp these state plans. So all the more reason why it's important to listen to the next webinar, you know, get involved in state advocacy so your plan is as strong as possible, you know, going in.
Okay. And I just want to, we had another question about accessing the recording. The recording will be available to you tomorrow, will be emailed to you. Next question is that in ESSA, when they say competitive salary, what is the definition of competitive salary? Competitive with whom? The best below minimum wage salary? You're asking.
No, so competitive integrated employment is a term that comes out of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and it is defined as the same salary that someone else in a similar position would be making. So it's definitely not below minimum wage, because nobody in a similar position without a disability would be making below minimum wage. And so it would really, you know, depend on the position. So if you're in an entry-level job and that's what most people would be paid minimum wage for, then you get paid minimum wage. You know, if you've been around for a number of years and anyone in that position, you know, would be paid more, then that's what competitive employment is. And integrated is, you know, in a setting with non-disabled workers.
Next question, have we maintained highly qualified teacher standards for students receiving special ed services in ESSA?
No, that unfortunately was taken out of ESSA, despite all objections to the contrary. So it is really up to the state now to define, you know, what are the qualifications for a qualified teacher. And, you know, a lot of states have their own requirements that, you know, have been brought along since we've had No Child Left Behind. We had it since, you know, 2002. It was the effective date. And, you know, a lot of states have put in place fairly high standards for educators. And we're hoping they're not just going to throw them out the window, but under the law, really all a special educator has to have is a bachelor's degree in something. And, you know, we're hoping that states are not going to lower their standards to that minimal level.
So here's another question. I'm a little confused regarding IDEA and FAPE versus ESSA. Has the law changed with the wording of appropriate, or is ESSA still trying to push for education to be better than just appropriate?
Well, there are two different laws, and the language in IDEA talks about a free, appropriate education. And ESSA doesn't talk about FAPE because it's for all kids. It's not specifically for kids with disabilities. But the argument is that if ESSA says that all students should have the equitable opportunity or a significant opportunity for an equitable, fair, and high-quality education, then when you interpret IDEA and what appropriate means, then that word appropriate should be aligned with the purposes for all students under ESSA. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense. So, you know, we're trying to, you know, make that argument and raise the bar. That's not to say we still don't have those strong provisions under ESSA, regardless of what happens with the Supreme Court. But there are unfortunately financial reasons are really the reason a lot of people are pushing against raising what appropriate means, because they're afraid there'll be more lawsuits, you know, about if the standard is higher and, you know, that school systems won't be able to, you know, give those services or whatever. But really under ESSA, they're supposed to be doing certain things, and that law, you know, that law and that language will still stand. It just kind of muddies the waters. And we have had for years two different kinds of language between the two statutes, and, you know, we've been arguing in individual cases, you know, that ESSA raises the bar, but, you know, it would be very unfortunate if ESSA can't be used to raise the bar in this lawsuit. So I remain hopeful that it will, but we still have the language in ESSA to use, you know, anyway.
Okay, so the next question is, we're preparing a document to submit to the state. What is the timeline of the implementation, and how soon do we have to submit it to the state?
Well, every state is different, and that's why I have that Google Doc about what's happening in your state, because what's happening is states at different time periods are putting forth drafts of their state plan, and they put them up on the website, and you may or may not be told about it, and then they have a period of time that they're taking public comment on that, and then they'll may put up another draft, you know, based on that comment. But you can always, there are always email addresses, and I have an email address for every state in that Google Doc that was linked in this presentation. But you can always directly send to the state, you know, these are our comments overall, whether or not, you know, you're in the middle of a so-called public comment on that draft period or not. But, you know, you can find from that Google Doc, at least my best effort to be able to find out what the different drafts and what the different deadlines are. But I would never hesitate, even if they say the deadline for submitting comments on this draft is over. I would not, you may not be able to use that online document that they may close, but you can always email information to that email address for each state that I've provided.
So is there any public report card on the states so the Down syndrome community can learn where their state or even their local school districts fall?
Yes, so part of this law back under No Child Left Behind is that there have to be state and local report cards. And so on your state website, your State Department of Education website, you should be able to pull that, go on to there and find your state report card, you know, Google your state report card or look on your, you know, your Department of Ed website, and then you should be able to, you know, look under your district and look under schools in your district and see where they fall. The problem is, and we'll talk more about this in the next webinar, but even with reporting requirements, the degree to which state schools have to report how their kids with disabilities are doing depends on this minimum subgroup size. And just quickly, I'll say what that is, just because that's kind of a gatekeeper issue. I mean, if you don't fix that, then there won't be accountability in general. And so the state decides what the minimum subgroup size set is, and they basically say that because of confidentiality and because of statistical reliability, you know, we think that the minimum subgroup size has to be, say, 30. And so then if you have a school, say a elementary school, and 3rd through 5th grade are the assessed grades, and you only have 29 kids in that assessed grade, those assessed grades all together when you add them up, instead of 30, they won't even have to report for what the kids with disabilities are doing at your school, let alone there be any accountability. So as we'll talk next week, we're really pushing an effort to get that minimum subgroup size less than 10. And there are states, including Maryland's 5 right now, that have done less than 10. And it really, having this higher end size really blocks your ability to see how kids are doing with disabilities and to have accountability measures for them. And there have been effective advocacy efforts. One of the states that that Advocacy Institute and NDSC did an analysis on was Delaware, and they were proposing an N size of 30, and they just put out their second draft and they lowered it to 15 because of that analysis. So, it is possible to change what is happening, and that's why, this next webinar is so important.
Okay, so are the grant funds to implement ESSA only available under Title I? I think did you answer that? I heard that there were maybe some shift of title funds.
Yeah, I mean, there's not Title I, has funding. There are also other titles under ESSA, not just Title I, that there are different funding mechanisms. For example, there is the LEARN Act, which provides comprehensive reading instruction, and that's a separate. There are a lot of grant programs. There's a lot of different funding that comes under Title I. Part of the money is supposed to be used for if these schools are identified as, and we'll discuss what this means, schools that need targeted support and improvement or comprehensive support and improvement, and to help them improve. And those schools are not necessarily Title I schools. They're more likely to be for obvious reasons, but because a lot of times Title I schools are not given the best resources or the best teachers, and so the students are not performing as well, but they're not necessarily Title I schools.
I'm sorry, I was muted. So one more question. I'm going to grab this question and then we're going to wrap it up since we're at the top of the hour. What impact do you think the new Secretary of Education will have on protecting or advancing implementation of the current requirements?
Wow, loaded question.
Yeah,
okay.
Very loaded.
Loaded question. We do have concerns about the nominee because a lot of the work she has done thus far has been around vouchers and privatizing of education, and there are a lot of concerns about how well vouchers serve the disability community, because a lot of times the schools will not take students with disabilities and they don't get to keep their IDEA rights. And, so far her record has been a lot around not having federal intervention. So we would, based on her record, we would be concerned that she would be more about sending kids out to schools and giving them money and leaving kids in the public school that might have disabilities, especially significant disabilities, which less private schools are willing to take, and also very poor kids who, when they get vouchers, they don't have enough money to pay the rest of the funds. Beyond that, also because of her position has been very much around, state-oriented and not federal government involvement, we would be concerned about the rigor with which the peer reviewers would review these state plans, because in the analyses that Advocacy Institute and NDSC has made, we have found that a lot of these states are violating the law. They are not in their plans that they are making. They are not following the law. And I think in large part they may not understand the law, but somebody has to be there, from the federal government to tell them, this is not okay. So I don't know for a fact. I don't have really, she has not spoken on any of these issues, and NDSC has submitted a number of questions to the Senate committee that will be doing the confirmation hearing, and the hope will be that, the likelihood from what I hear is that she will get confirmed, but that if she is confirmed, to at least get her on the record as saying that she will, support strongly students with disabilities, their rights under IDA, their rights under ESSA, and the rest, so that, we can have something to go on going forward. But, there isn't a lot of information out there to be certain in any way, where she would fall. But, there are indicators that are worrisome. I hope I navigated that.
Like a true politician.
You were very diplomatic, Ricky.
All right, so I'm gonna let you guys both just get any closing remarks, and we were getting some thank yous, but I'm not taking any more questions. So go ahead and just, Ricky, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I would just really encourage you. I thank Heather very much, since she won't be on the next two, but she's a big part of the joint effort between NDSC and NDSS in doing education and putting it out there together, which I know is what families want. So thank you very much, Heather. I really encourage you to please come to the next webinar that Jawanda and I will do on the state advocacy. It's complicated, but it's worth knowing because you need it for not only your advocacy, but also after your plans are done to understand what's happening in your state when they say that your school may be, falling in one of these categories. And then, of course, I think the third one, the IEP one, will be helpful to you in terms of some language you could use that maybe help you get some of the things that you're looking to get in the IEP. And, of course, Adrian, he's a superstar, and it'll be great, to hear what he has to say about self-advocates. So thank you for your time.
All right, Heather.
And this is Heather, and I, just wanted to thank, to thank Ricky and NDSC, and then also to thank Dina and DSAIA, which is just an amazing, amazing organization, and hope that we can all continue to collaborate. It's really about getting out the information to our community and getting them the tools to empower them to take a stand and to, fight for our own kids, but also for the broader disability community. So I hope that these webinars will give you all the tools to do that. Education advocacy certainly does not end with ESSA. We're looking at, the Higher Education Act Opportunity Act is probably going to come up for reauthorization. IDEA is going to come up for reauthorization sometime in the next few years. So let's band together as a community collectively and lay the groundwork to really make our voices heard on so many of these issues. Thank you.
Absolutely. We second that. Thank you, Dina.
You are welcome. We got Nancy was nice enough to say, thanks DSAI, affiliates aren't well versed in legislative advocacy. Keep them connected with NDSS and NDSC work, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. It's not what we do, but we're all about the affiliates, and we appreciate both of you guys being on this tonight. And just for everyone who's still on and who will listen to this recording later, make sure that you attend the next two sessions, and we'll keep the recordings available, but it's so nice to be able to ask those questions. So thank you, Heather. Thank you, Ricky, so much, and we'll talk to everyone soon. We'll see you again next week.
Good night.